Welcome, audience, to the Just Thoughts podcast for modern day leaders who want to think better thoughts about leadership and entrepreneurship in the modern world. I'm Nicolas Dolenc, call me Nikki. He, him is my prefix. I'm joined here by Chisom Udeze today, who's a six-time founder and winner of the Diversity Leader of the Year from 2023. Really pleasure to have you here, Chisom. In your own words, what does it require to be a leader or a diversity leader in today's world?
Oh, Hi, thanks for having me. Um, Perhaps I want to reflect more on what it requires to be a leader. I'm not sure what it requires to be a diversity leader, to be honest. It's a great honor that was bestowed onto me by the Nordic Women in Tech Awards, and it's humbling. Um, I think so my leadership journey has been kind of like one of learning, and unlearning. It's recognizing that to lead I also need to be able to follow, but that I also need to be able to engage with courage, and that I need to be able to engage with curiosity.
Mm,
And I'm an economist, right? So for me, I'm always thinking about what do we optimize? What do we optimize in workplaces? What do we optimize in society? What do we even optimize in institutions? And depending on the context, what needs to be improved is is different. So I also think about leadership as adaptability.
mm,
Requires kind of like a lot of humility, recognizing that you don't know everything, you don't know what you don't know. But of course, there are some standards, like in terms of like best practices. So if you're running an organization, how do you think about leadership from the perspective of having the right people?
mm,
Who can carry, whatever it is you're building, and making sure that you have people who are also motivated, and
mm.
then your work is not to demotivate them, so to say. So there are a lot of things, of course, I can talk about, but maybe I put a pin in it right
That's
now for your next.
an interesting perspective. Like, try not to demotivate them. Like,
Yes.
how many leaders do stuff in today's world that actually demotivates people, and how many children in today's world are not born motivated by general,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So it's
mm.
like society might demotivate us to do things, but I've never heard about a person who would be intrinsically not motivated about anything.
Absolutely. But you can also you maybe you can reflect on the fact that some people are not motivated to do certain tasks. Like I am terrible at sales. I
Mm,
have zero interest in sales, for example. It's not for me. And then if I must do it, I do it because I must. But
mm,
it's not where I thrive. Like in entrepreneurship, like people say kind of your area of genius, it's not my area, right? Now, if you have someone in sales within your organization who doesn't burn for
mm,
it, you might need to motivate them to do that work, right? Whereas if you have somebody who's just naturally motivated, who can go up to people and talk to them, I'm painfully shy, right? Like, so for me, the idea of walking up to somebody and say, hey, let me talk to you about something, oh my gosh, I want to cringe, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, um, I think the focus again is on the right people who are motivated for whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, and also adaptable to whatever comes, because businesses continue to evolve, right? They're
mm,
usually not static. So you need people who are motivated, and then the work is not to demotivate them, because oftentimes,
mm.
depending on your leadership or the lack thereof, people can get demotivated, people can lose interest, people may not feel valued, people may not feel included. And that is where the work is. So rather than motivating, focus on not demotivating the right people.
So before going into this motivational part, like, assume you get the right people, or like finding the right people is the first step, right? So if we go into that, what are your skills as a leader to finding the right people, some mistakes you might have made, or some successes you see, or something you kind of repeatedly do when you're trying to recruit or find the right people?
I think I've made my fair share of mistakes in terms of like recruiting. Um, I think, and what I'm learning is that it is less expensive to wait for the right person rather than to hurry to hire someone because you need that spot filled. So I've made a few of this, like, we need someone, we need extra hands. They
Mm,
seem good enough, and maybe for that particular project, they were good enough, but
mm,
they were not the right person for the long term, for the continuation, for that adaptability that comes with working in the very always evolving landscape that our company exists in. So I think for me, being very clear on who the right person is. I think I also used to focus a lot on what the task was, like,
mm,
so the job to be done. And I'm learning that, at least for me and my leadership style and the organization that we're trying to build, we can't focus on the what. So rather than starting with the what, we start with the who. Who are the right people? Who are the
mm,
self starters? Who are the people with the entrepreneurial mindset, the risk takers, the
mm,
people who have agency? Those are the type of people we're looking for. So it's also thinking about it within the context of the work that
mm,
we do. And also people, I think, like in my lessons about, like, how do you get the right people, it's also reflecting on myself as a leader and
mm,
thinking about what is the brutal truth of the organization that
mm,
we have currently, and where would we like to go. So it's that thing about, like, facing the brutal fact of, like,
mm.
where we're at, we're not doing as well as we need to do, we're not, whatever it is,
Yeah.
and then being optimistic that we will get there, but knowing that the way to get there is with the right people on the
Mm.
bus.
Understood. And when you go, like, if you go into one step more detail, like when you start figuring out, okay, you need a person, or you're starting a new endeavor, and who do you need with you? Like, do you write a job description? Do you write who the personality should be? Or do you just like talk to people and then find interest? Like, what is your like go-to process there?
We've done a combination. I think, like, if you look at it from my team level, like, oftentimes there are people. So if we look at Diversify, so one of the organizations I founded, um, normally, I think 9 times out of 10, a lot of our employees start out with us as interns. And this is, of course, given the phase the organization is at. So we get to know them, get to know their skills, and then, like, every employee we have, no, most of the employees we have in that organization all started as interns, because then we get to see how they evolve, how they engage, how they take initiative, how they have agency. And then we very quickly decide within a short period of time that, yeah, this is somebody we want on the team. We do this because, of course, we've had in the past where we've hired someone because their CV looked great, they did really well at interview, their references were wonderful, and then after they joined the team, it did not work out, and they weren't a good contribution to the organization as we had hoped, even though they were lovely people. So after, I think, making this mistake twice, maybe 3 times, we decided, okay, how else can we engage this, especially being a nonprofit organization with very little resources. We cannot afford to continue to make this type of mistakes. So how can we do better, in a sense? But for me, in how I engage people, recruit, I think it's really interesting, in the other spaces I occupy and the other work that I do, it's looking at who has done this job before, who's already doing this job.
Mm,
What is their success rate like? How have they been able to go against, the status quo and create something else? Because that's also quite important for me. It's like who are the trailblazers, the game changers, the system shakers,
mm,
and ideally somebody who's already doing the thing,
mm,
or is very, like, even if it might not be the exact same role in the exact same type of industry, that they have a track record of success, of materializing impact, of creating change within an organization in a way that is measurable, in a
Mm.
way that, also kind of like what they learn, what they do is transferable and then adaptable to different contexts.
That's a lot of requirements for, like, if you'd, like, not everybody is like this, right? So what you're explaining is you are, or I'm making some assumptions here. Like when you're recruiting for an entrepreneurial endeavor, that's what you want. But then, like, if you're recruiting for a bigger organization, right? These are not the same sort of requirements, or are they actually?
I think it depends on the context. So, like I said, like with the nonprofit, like we diversify, we start with interns, and then there are a lot of people who just make themselves so invaluable to us. They leave us no option than to hire them,
Yeah.
So that is a lot more flexible. But when you're working at a larger organizational level, so if you want to hire in an organization with, say, 10,000 employees and you're looking for a C-suite, you don't just take a risk, like you can take a calculated risk, but it
Mm.
needs to be somebody who has a proven track record of being able to create or materialize change. It doesn't have to be, of course, if you're looking for an accountant, a CFO, you want to see that they've been able to apply their skills
Mm.
in a different space. It could be they worked in a medical field, or that they work, like in maritime and shipping,
Mm.
but that skill is still transferable to whatever sector you put them in. So I don't think that's a heavy ask, depending on the organization and depending on the level and depending on what you are trying to materialize. So for me, I have to often think about leadership contextually, since I operate in different spaces. So if I'm talking about this purely from this nonprofit perspective and the work we do at Diversify, that there is a process, because for us, Diversify has also been kind of like one of the reasons I founded it. Is I also wanted to be able to create job opportunities for people who oftentimes are not included in the workforce, not because they are in skill, but because they don't speak Norwegian, for example, right? So we have a lot of highly skilled internationals working with
Mm.
us, so to say. So it depends. It's very contextual.
Okay, fair enough. You describe yourself as an economist and somebody who likes to optimize things, and you've done 6 endeavors now. So what I would like to ask about these is, some of them are for profit and some of them are non-profit. What
Mm.
is your process of evaluating which endeavor should be a for-profit endeavor and which one is a non-profit? And if you could tell a bit about the origin of these and how many of them are actually still going out of these 6 businesses.
Mm. I think all of them are still going. Um, so yeah, the question around, so I'll come back to this, but the
Yeah.
question around what is a nonprofit, which is not, how do I evaluate them?
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of my endeavors, if we look at the nonprofit space, has been for something that I needed. I know there are people who do things because they want to impact the world and
Mm.
um, they want to empower people. I think that is, of course, on the list of my ultimate goals for
Mm.
sure. But oftentimes for me, the gaps I try to fill are the gaps that I have firsthand knowledge or experience
Mm.
in. So Diversify initially at its infancy was to fill a void where I came to Norway and I couldn't really crack it
Mm.
socially to integrate. Of course, it doesn't help that I'm shy as a person. But I struggled, and in trying to understand that struggle. So the one thing about me is, I can't sit in struggle for too long. Like
Mm.
something has to change, something has to happen. And sometimes it's okay, we're starting an organization.
Mm.
Um, so it depends on if this is a broad societal challenge, right? And working in the space we do at Diversify, where we're trying to work with immigrants, we're trying to work with women, we're trying to work with refugees, we're working with organizational systems and structures, policymakers. That type of work requires a lot of advocacy. Type of work requires, I guess, in the it also requires like a multi-stakeholder partnership. We need other people to do this work, so
Mm,
to say. And then a lot of the work that we do also provides services to our target groups free of charge. So
mm.
I also think about that in terms of what makes it a not-for-profit, because we're creating space for people who might not be able to provide, or sorry, to pay for the services that we offer. And then we need to figure out where funding for those services can come from. So
Okay.
this is kind of like one of the first problems I think of.
One of the primary things then, to summarize and to understand you correctly, like if the primary customer group is not able to pay for the services, that is
Yes.
your criteria for.
That is one of my criteria,
Okay.
right? And then for me as well, it's also, is this a passion project? Is this, and that was how Diversify started ultimately. Like, I didn't set out to start an organization, to be honest. As I don't want to give false information in that regard. I just sought out to do something for highly skilled immigrants who didn't get work. I had 2 weeks. I thought I could do an event. I did an event. I thought 20 people will come. 115 people came. I understood there was a bigger problem, and it was something I wanted to keep doing. And it kind of just evolved. So I went based on the need, and it naturally evolved as, of course, how do I ask people who who benefit from the work that we do to pay me for something when they don't have work, they're
Mm,
struggling. So, of course, for me, that's been a primary thing. Can they afford to pay for this service, or is this a social
yeah.
service? So that's also something I think about. Is it is a social service. It makes a social impact. It's
Mm,
beneficial for the society as a whole,
mm.
and that can be not a not-for-profit, or that can be a for-profit. So I think it really just comes down to the person and the individual and how they think about it, to be honest.
That's a fair take. So when it comes to your for-profit endeavors, like
Mhm.
which are them, and can you kind of tie back these reflections on like your decisions and why you've chosen to make these endeavor for profit?
Yeah.
Uh,
So if we look at Herspace, Herspace started out as a co-working, co-creation space for women, for mothers, and for non-binary folk. And it needed to be a for-profit because we had, up until recently, of a physical space, which
mm,
requires rent to be paid, of course, and as a co-working space, we expected that people would come use it as, their office, and especially around, like, the lockdown and COVID and the
mm,
pandemic, that people needed spaces, especially because they didn't have their offices to go to. So that was the premise. And of
mm,
course, it evolved from that in terms of, it became a community where people were feeling quite isolated. They could come together, they could work, they could cook together, they could engage.
mm,
And in that regard, we had, like, events or gatherings where, people just paid a small amount of money. It wasn't significant. So I think the main thing around that was mainly because we needed to have, and I don't know that this is the best business idea I've had in the world, but it also came about because I was feeling lonely. I just had a kid,
mm,
my first child, and I didn't know how to be a parent, and I come from a place where, like, it takes a village to raise a child. But
mm,
because of the pandemic, my sisters couldn't come, my mom couldn't come visit, so I needed a village, and I created a village. So I will say Herspace has been my most emotional
mm,
uh, business venture, but it
mm.
turned out a lot of women, a lot of people were also feeling the same, and this was why we were able to do well in terms of, like, be attractive to the people we're targeting. So that mainly just came down to uh, uh, um,
So to
we're
be
renting
clear now,
space.
and so I can follow correctly, her space is a for-profit,
Yes.
and they and kind of have paid something, right? And that's been like one of the criteria there.
Yes, because
Yeah,
I mean, it's a for-profit that
yeah,
requires direct money out of us,
yeah.
and co-working space, and people need to pay for that space.
Yes. And then you were saying about creating the village and what that has meant to you, and it's more most emotional. journey so far?
Yeah, if I had to do it again as a business venture, I would not do it as a business venture. Like I would not. Let me reframe that.
Mm,
Let me clarify that. Maybe I would not rent such an expensive space because it was a space in
mm,
the middle of the city, like literally right downtown, and that was
mm,
expensive. So that was something that was very like a stressful thing for me.
yeah.
Um, but in terms of what I got from it, I would do it again in terms of the
Mm,
community and kind of like the space that it became. So we participated in placemaking Oslo, right? Where people had a place where they knew they were always welcome. They could always walk in, they could participate in events, they could meet people in community.
mm,
Oftentimes, when people moved to Oslo, we
mm,
were their first stop. They Googled, they found us, and they came and they immediately found community. So, in essence, it became meaningful to me because when I came to Oslo, I
mm,
struggled for about 6 months to find even community. And I
mm,
always kind of thought if I could reduce this time for
mm,
people, then my pain means something. So when I hear that people within a week or two of coming to Oslo, they already have a loving community, they know where to go, like it means, okay, that pain means something to me.
mm,
But just to share about business,
mm.
period. So if you look at Diversify Consult, which is a consulting company, we provide services to optimize workplaces across the world.
Okay,
And so that is a non-emotional, very clear business venture that is a for-profit venture.
fair enough. Thank you for sharing that story. Listening to you, I get the sense that you have a problem and then you solve it with entrepreneurship. Period. That's like
Yeah.
your approach, fairly. Um, how do you then juggle? So you're a mother. I can relate to the fact having two kids as well that are small and juggling a business on the side of multiple endeavors. How do you juggle what is your kind of trick to juggle the six, and where do you struggle when it comes to juggling all these businesses? Like, do you have rules of thumb for yourself, or like how do you what's your trick? Because it's always hard and you're going to be balancing it, but have you found something that would work for you?
I have a process, but sometimes, of course, it flies out of the window depending on how busy things are. Um, so I juggle it with ease and with difficulty. It just
Mm,
depends on like the period or the season I'm in life. I
mm,
think trying to be present for the kids when they're not in kindergarten, when they're home. So learning to turn off my computer and say, I'm done now. By the time they come back, I don't always do it successfully, to be honest, because sometimes there are deadlines we have to meet, or I
yeah,
have to meet, or this I have to travel the next day and I need to prepare something. But
mm,
just being acutely aware and trying to be mindful of even when I'm working, when my daughter tries to get my attention, that
mm,
to give her that 5 minutes, and not say, no, no, baby, I'm trying to finish something. And
mm,
that's not always easy because I catch myself in the, baby, I'm trying to finish. And then I'm like, no, no, tell me, what can I do? Right. Um, I think oftentimes when you work a lot and you have some success, people might view you as someone who has it all figured out.
mm,
Um, and I really don't want to give that impression. I think it's important for people to understand that
mm,
it's all a struggle. It's all a balancing act. And sometimes I do well and sometimes I don't. I do have a really great partner who, we support each other depending on,
mm.
how difficult things are. But no, I'm still figuring it out, Nikki. What about you? How are you doing it?
um I think I've learned to set boundaries and say no.
Mm,
And then when I might like I've chosen to focus on the stuff that gives me energy, right? So
mm,
uh, when it comes to work related stuff, so my writing and this blog is something that gives me energy. When I get into it, I block it out. I use my calendar to block out like
Mm.
kids and when to get out. I usually fail to get out of whatever I'm doing to be on time to fit the rest of the evening.
Mm.
And then we spend a lot of time together. Like we have like specific things we always do, and then
Mm.
it doesn't happen, then the kids get kind of agitated. So like one is like play games together, because in that
Mm.
moment you're doing some. For us, it's like board games or card games.
Mm.
That was one. And then I think like kind of the balancing act when they were younger, when I was working at Slush, I had the older one. I had him with me to the office all the time, or most of the time. So kind of that. And I think with their mother at the time, kind of equally, it's important and makes it easier when you have a partner you respect and who wants to help out and who wants to share the load both ways, and then finding the tricks that allow you to spend the time with it. I guess those have been mine. Time will tell if you've done it perfectly or not, but I guess one of the best advice I got from somebody who's been on my podcast previously, Calvin Soh from Singapore. His children are now adults. The older one is 20, and the younger one, I think she's 16 or something. And I met them when they were 13 and 9 or
Mm.
something. He told me, and reflect back, he told me it's not about how you raise your children; it's about how you let your children raise you.
Mm.
So that to me is like, oh, I don't need to figure everything out.
Mm.
Like a small baby will always tell you, right? They will tell you when you're hungry. When they're
Mm.
hungry, they want to poop or they want to eat. And then
Yeah.
you try with this, like they have needs and they will act like up, right? And then you need to figure out what it is.
Yeah. I guess one way I reflect on this, and I think that's a really great reflection. I think when we're reflecting it, I grew up with an entrepreneurial mom, right? My mom ran runs successful businesses, and so she was also quite busy.
Mm,
And my mom, gave us everything we wanted, perhaps most of the things that we needed. But I try to reflect on what I wish I had more of
mm,
that I didn't have with my mother. And also looking at the things that she's done exceedingly well and trying to replicate those, and the
mm,
things that I wish were a bit more present. I think coming from the household and the kind of culture that I did, um, you just kind of knew you were loved by things that were provided for you, but it wasn't said often. So I do agree that children ask for the things that they want and they raise you in a sense, but I do think that there needs to be an intention in how we raise or give kids examples. Like if I look at my kids, my at least my youngest is a year and a half, so we're still seeing his character come up. But my daughter, a lot of how she shows up in the world
mm,
has more to do with what she sees than what she hears,
mm,
right? So I could tell her you were brave or you were beautiful or you were strong, but the things she takes after the most, it's like how I show up in spaces like I take my kid everywhere, like to work, wherever I need to, especially because I travel quite a lot. But I try to be quite intentional in the little things, in the acknowledgements, in the affirmations, that I provide them. And also the ability to have them question me. My daughter, we've raised her to kind of like ask us for answers.
mm,
Why did you do this? Or you made me sad when you do this. And then also apologizing, recognizing that, you know, for us, yeah, I guess for me that intention is so important, that my daughter is not responsible for me being busy or for me
mm.
having a bad day, that I am nonetheless responsible to show up like the mother she
Yeah,
deserves, so to say.
and to kind of you need to make that safe space, right? So
Mm.
touching upon the subject and bringing it back a bit to the entrepreneurial part and the leadership part, like how would you suggest, because we're parents and being entrepreneurs and we bring our kids to work, right?
Mm.
That doesn't feel very natural to everyone.
Mm. Mm.
Uh, and there are many who want to keep like family life separate
Mm.
from work.
Mm.
Like what would you be your suggestions to kind of an audience to evaluate, or we can together like ponder what would be the right way of going about this? Like
Mm.
what were your thoughts on this? Like
Mm.
for me it just happened. It's like I don't question it, haven't put much thought to it. When I know
mm,
people and leaders who are like, no, what happens in family
mm,
and private is private, and my kids
mm,
won't show up to me
mm.
work, for example.
Yeah. I honestly think that to each their own. I think people have to reflect on what works the best for them. I grew up I was in boarding school a lot, but when I
Mm,
had the opportunity, my mom always took me to work.
mm,
And I learned so much. Like I understood the value of work since as young as like 10 and 11. I understood what my mom was doing. I My mom is like this god to me because I revered just I understood the work it took. And I think he also gave me a lot of compassion for my mother because I understood that she's doing this so I could have a better life. You
mm,
know, I think as well, I'm quite intentional about the spaces I take my kid to. So if we're doing a conference, it's so important to me that my daughter sees that somebody like her can be on stage, not just her mother, but anyone. So it's about also reflecting on what we pass on. You
mm,
know, like my daughter has met so many people from across the world, from
mm,
different cultures that no education will teach her that. You
mm,
know, like this spaces she gets to occupy. And I grew up quite similar where I was sitting down at the table with my mother and her friends, and they were sharing stories of life. And I didn't understand it then, but I think it made me, I like to think I'm reasonably wise. And I think it's made me wise and curious, but also made me quite humble because there's always something I can learn. So I think it depends. Yeah. I know that some families cannot afford to take their children to work depending on the type of workplace that they're in.
mm,
But for me, it's quite important that children are a part of life. I don't think children should be separated. And
mm,
even outside of work, like sometimes I'm invited to parties
mm,
where they say no children allowed at somebody's house. And
mm.
yeah, I know that's my reaction, right? But for some people, this is completely normal. But for
Yeah,
me, in Nigerian and the culture I grew up in, children are always invited. Like I wouldn't take a child to a bar, you know, or like places that are rowdy, but a party at somebody's house, it's really, and when you don't have family around, it's even more difficult. So for me, children should be a part of life.
that should. And I think in defense of not having children, adults should have the luxury of also, or like parents, kind of there would be spaces where
Of
you can
course.
get together, and then there are spaces, so like completely excluding children like that. I usually organize I've usually organized, like for example, at companies, I've organized like the family events, and then only for the or the employees and the adults to kind of
Mm,
be more inclusive. That is my way of dealing with that
yeah.
situation.
Nikki, I don't know about you, but just sometimes, I mean, I totally just want to not be around kids. Not even my children. I want to go out with my girlfriends and have a blast.
So that's what I'm saying. Like you don't, like it's healthy to not think they need to be with you
Oh,
absolutely everywhere, but kind of completely excluding them. And one thing I've done, like on the remark that's not kind of work related, but like exposing them to different cultures and different ways of thinking, is like the tradition we have is go on the pride parade. Like that's
mm,
like what we do. Like I'm heterosexual and a
mm,
I don't know, a stereotypical unit. I'm divorced, so that's different for me. But and I don't have a history in the sexual minorities or anything like that. But for my kids, like seeing that it's normal that families are different, and then
mm-hmm,
remembering and having memories about the fact that, oh, there's a rainbow family, it's a normal thing, you know. So
mm,
I wouldn't have these biases and prejudices that we've had to like unlearn as
mm,
adults because it wasn't talked about or educated when I was younger. If you
mm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Nikki, I have a question for you. I did read your article, I think a few weeks ago, where you kind of talked about navigating parenthood, entrepreneurship, and divorce. So I
Mm.
do want to ask you, like, how is that for you? How has, if you feel up to answering, like,
No,
what have you learned? How do you balance? How do you navigate it?
I mean, my I'm very open about it, and I think the turmoil I've been through, my approach is if I go through something that is hard or turmoil, like people don't talk about these things, so then I can maybe help people feel less lonely by sharing your story. And my divorce story, in short, like we went through therapy, which was a very big thing before, like we actually got divorced, which helped the relationship later on. And I have the utmost like respect and admiration for the mother of my children. So I'm happy to say we have a very healthy relationship in that regard, and both parents and are together. Um, I think I was fairly young when I got children and started, entrepreneurship, and had high ambition levels as a, I don't know, 25-year-old. I didn't know how privileged I was most of the time when I was younger. Like, I'm a heterosexual, white, cisgender male in a society where this is the norm, right? Uh, but I did hang out with a lot of people different from me. But like the since I was young, since my father is Brazilian, but growing up like this in a society in Finland and then playing sports, it's all about like achievement and the next thing and the bigger, and a lot of like that. So you lived up to the expectations of what society thought you should be without stopping to say like, what do I actually want? Like, I was living so fast and you were going according to all of that. So like my divorce process was also like, what do you actually want? I'm living somebody else's plan, and what is mine, and what do I want to do? And who do I get energy from, and who I love? I think I listened to another podcast, Uduak Aminos podcast, and you've had a lot of people in your life, and we hadn't touched upon this yet. So throwing the back ball to you on like, how do you deal with relationships, and defining like what gives you energy and what not.
Hmm.
How is that like? Because you've lived what, in 7 countries? Five,
Nine now. Nine
nine
now.
countries,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
you mentioned that previously, that like you have relationships and you build your own communities in these new countries, right? And then you leave those countries, and that means you might need to leave some people behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how has that like formed your?
Yeah. Um, I think it's really interesting to see the different versions of me that exist in different contexts. And it doesn't mean that any of those versions are not authentic. It just means that in different spaces, I get to explore different parts of myself that I did not even know. So, a simple example of that could be, for example, in Norway, I'm a completely different person to a degree than I am in Nigeria. And then I'm different in the US,
Mm,
and I was different in the Netherlands or in the UK. Um, I think I have learned as I get older about boundaries. So when you talked about boundaries earlier in terms of kind of like how you navigate kind of like balanced parenting, it's something that is quite present for me,
mm,
and not just boundaries with other people, which I think is absolutely necessary, but also boundaries for myself, knowing where to say no, really reflecting on how does this make me feel.
mm,
And I struggle, I navigate, anxiety. So I have an anxiety disorder, and I also have ADHD. And what that also means for me, luckily, I think, in a sense, is my body feels something before my brain processes it.
mm,
So if I'm in a space that is not good for me, if I'm engaging with someone I shouldn't be, if I have friends who kind of are succubuses and they take everything out of me, my body already starts telling me. So what I'm starting to do more is to
mm,
listen. So it's just recognizing how I create boundaries, but also how I ensure that I'm taking care of myself. Because while self-care is having that space to meditate and to do yoga and like to go on hikes, for me, self-care is also just recognizing, who am I, what is my truth in this moment, and
mm,
also giving myself space to change my mind tomorrow or in
mm,
3 months, right? Because we're also people, as people, we evolve. And so it's permission to change, permission to say no, permission to say yes after I've said no. So it's like I'm learning. I read a lot. I try to talk to people, like you, hear from them, learn from them. So it's a process for me as well.
I can relate to the fact that the body feels things before your brain can actually process them. And
Mm,
going through all that I've been through, kind of knowing that if it feels bad in the body, it means that something should be done differently. So
mm,
coming from the sports background and reflecting where I was, right? So I remember times at Slush when I people remember me vividly. When I get stressed, I start coughing, right? I have this, like, that's my acid stomach acting up out of stress. And it sounds really, really bad at times. And when it got really bad, I used to puke in the mornings. And I was just like, this is just me being stressed and it's completely like normal. And then you were running like that for a very long time. Because when you were doing sports, sometimes you train so hard, you puke, right?
mm,
It's like part of trying to be a top athlete. Basketball was my game. So I thought like it's endless. And then kind of it wasn't about how hard you burn out. It was about like high performance is also like pushing yourself to the limit and then learning how to fix the recovery part. I think one thing I've learned is like the recovery part is like when to take the space from yourself, when to listen to the body, and when not pushing myself. And I guess
mm,
the hardest part today, in the modern world and with the kids and everything, is like being on a screen or a phone is not necessarily winding down and setting
mm,
boundary for yourself when it's stressful, when the deadlines need to be met and everything's happening at the same time. So
mm.
I'd like to kind of bridge back to like what you've done and where is Chisom going to be in the future? What's next for you and for Diversify? And what are the future plans?
Right. I often find that question one of the most stressful questions just because my future plan changes quite often. Not because I move on to something else, because I just achieve it quicker and then I move on to the next thing. Um, but also because I have to almost narrow myself into this is the future plan, whereas for me, there are like 20 at any given time that I want to pursue. But, anyways, to your question, um, I think my future plans personally would be continuing to pursue wellness, what that means for me as an individual, what that means for me as a parent, what that means for me as a partner or as a employee, sorry, as an employer and a leader. For Diversify as an organization, I think the nonprofit arm of it, we are looking to do more global work. So there's a global expansion in the works. With our conference, for example, we're looking to touch continents in like Asia, like Europe, across Europe, so more countries across Europe, maybe North America, and also Africa. So there are currently things being planned in that direction. For the for-profit arm, Diversify Consult, we are working on a kind of like a DEI hub slash marketplace, kind of to be, hopefully that's the goal, the global hub for, vetted practitioners from across the world.
Mm,
um, I think in my current engagements, I'm working on a project in shipping and maritime,
mm,
looking to grow that as well. I really want to write a book. I really need to find the discipline to block out time to write something. And I will not be writing anything about DEI, just to make that clear. But, I feel like there are stories in me. I'm a huge movie buff. I've been watching movies my entire life, So I think there's a book inside me, and I really want to find time to start that process next year.
Look
Um,
forward to reading that and
yeah.
seeing how it goes. Um, I usually people ask, so like, what is the, advice you would give the younger self, blah blah. And I like to flip that thought around and say, like, what is the advice you want to give your future self
Hmm.
that you hope that you won't forget, or you hope you've achieved? Like, what is the advice you want to give your future self, not the past, right?
Hmm. Right. That's a really great question. I sometimes ask people the same, but I've never really had anyone ask me. So now I'm like, shoot, I haven't thought about this for myself. Um, if I reflect, say in 25 years,
Mm,
I want to just be able to say, Chisom, you did it. You did
mm,
everything you wanted to do. And
that's simple.
yeah, not because you did not have fear, but because you had courage and you did it anyway. And I guess what is present for me now, and I hope my future self continues to hold that, is if there's something you want to do it. Don't ask for permission. Just do it.
Just do it.
And yeah, I know it sounds like Nike, just do it. But yeah, just do it.
Picasso said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal, because great artists know the value of what they see." Right. So
Mm.
if you're stealing that because it's a good slogan,
Mm. Yeah. So
right?
you did it. I like that.
You did it.
You did it.
You
Yeah.
did it, Susan. We
Mm.
hope to kind of come back to this 25 years from now, and I can send you this 20 years
Yes.
later and say, Chisholm, you did it. Here's
Future
you.
Chisom did
This,
it.
this is
Yes.
you telling yourself you did it.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you
Mm.
for joining. If people want to learn more about your work, um, hear more of your thoughts about your work at Diversify, what would you hope the audience who want to become better leaders and want to learn more about entrepreneurship,
Mm.
what should they be listening to? Or
What should they be listening to? Oof. I think there are a lot of really great entrepreneurs in the Nordics. Yourself, Nikki, they should be listening to you. They should be listening and learning from your podcast.
from your
Yeah,
perspective,
from my end.
what do you
Um,
want them to do?
I think we have a lot of really great programs that cater towards entrepreneurs. Like we have HerTech, for example, which is an incubator for women who are running tech-enabled businesses. We'd love to hear from you as a partner, as a potential, entrepreneur in the program.
Mm,
In terms of leadership, I'm always open to engaging. So we'd be happy to have a conversation with your organization, with you. Reach out. I'm really terrible at this, as you can tell, Nikki, just in terms of like trying to sell myself and say, people come talk to us. But please do come talk to us. We're pretty good at what we do, either from the entrepreneurial perspective or even from the leadership perspective. I kind of nerd out on what it takes to be a great leader, an inclusive leader. And of course, like that always begins with ourselves. So, yeah.
amazing. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Thanks for having me.